Hey, everybody. Holy cow, do we have a lot to talk about today? My goodness. Not only did we miss a week because I was in the air going to CrimeCon, but we had a guilty verdict and a death penalty verdict since the last time we talked. So we have so much to talk about tonight. While we're waiting to spool up and while everybody's hopping on, I wanted to tell you a little bit about CrimeCon. Listen, CrimeCon was absolutely wonderful, and Nashville was a blast. If you've never been to Nashville, I've never been before. It is so much fun. It was really fun because my daughter joined me down there to help out with the booth. And we had an absolute blast. We went down and walked along Broadway, which is the main street running through Nashville. And it is the honky tonk district. So we drank a little beer and listened to a lot of music and just had a blast. We spent most of the day on Thursday going up and down Broadway, had a really nice dinner at a rooftop bar, restaurant, and then got ready for CrimeCon the next day. Now, I'm here to tell you, CrimeCon is amazing. It gets bigger every year. So I don't even know how many people were there, but I'm going to just show you this little video. This is just one of the breakout rooms for one of the presentations. There probably were 5 rooms this size and several more a little bit smaller. This was one of the larger breakout rooms. But I'm telling you what, there were people spanning up and down the halls, up and down. I mean, you wouldn't believe the number of people that were there. So I was in Creators Row, which is where all of the podcasters, and used to be called Podcast Row. Now it's Creators Row because there's so much more than just podcasting there. So there I am with the booth. And just to let you know, that is a stack of Justice for Tylee and JJ bracelets. And I am down to a handful. So if you have not gotten one and would like one, send a self-addressed stamped envelope to the address in our show notes, and I will hand them out until they're gone. But I gave out almost all of them. So there's the booth. I was right next to a bookseller, McFarland Publishing, who has a fairly wide true crime imprint, and a guy on the other side that has developed a true crime game. It's like a board game, but it's kind of like an escape room in a box. So anyway, really nice guy. And we had so much fun. We talked to so many. For those of you who came by and said hello, hi to everybody. It was so fun to meet so many people who I knew by their handles. And so I just want to say thanks if you dropped by. And we had a blast. The next one, I've put the information in the show notes. It is September 5th through 7th of 2025 in Denver, Colorado. So that Saturday night, after being at the table all day, we had a get together of creators there at the hotel. And I'm telling you what, I met some of the greatest people who I've known on YouTube and on Twitter forever. I met Ian of Runkle and the Bailey, the Canadian podcaster. I met Emily D. Baker. Scott Reich was there. Allie and Bob Mata were there. Brandy Churchwell was there. Joel Waldman was there, he and his wife Ileana. Carm wasn't there. They're doing a book tour for their book, and which is a memoir that Joel has written about Carm being a Holocaust survivor. So really interesting book. I read most of it coming and going on the airplane, and really had a great time. So, and then Sunday we wrapped things up, and I went back to my hotel and finished the last chapter and the epilogue of the book and sent it off to our editors. So the book is donezo. They are working on the typesetting right now, and as soon as I get the PDF, those of you who have signed up on the book launch league are going to get a digital copy. So I'll let you know when we're getting ready to send those out, but they'll be emailed to you at the email address that you signed up with. So, but I can tell you what, CrimeCon is busy, and I was, as they say in Nashville, tarred. It was busy and crazy and oh, so much fun. So we have so much to talk about today, so much to talk about the Daybell case. So I went back and looked at my notes and tried to go back as far back as the last time we talked. So my notes show that the last time we talked, the defense was just getting ready to put on their evidence. So I do want to run kind of quickly through the defense witnesses and through the rebuttal before we talk about the verdict. So, two other things about the book before I move on, and about CrimeCon. We have chosen a narrator for the audiobook, and it will come out the same time as the hardcover book does. So those of you who like your books on Audible, I think you're going to like the narrator. I was quite impressed with her, woman, and it will be out at the same time. The other thing I wanted to mention is that Summer Shiflet, Lori's sister, was at CrimeCon and was a presenter. And she appeared with Nate Eaton, and she did a beautiful job. I wasn't able to get away from my table long enough to go. Summer did come around and went by all of the booths and what have you, and dropped off these lovely pictures that say Aloha Mauloa, Tylee and JJ. So she dropped one of these off for me, along with lots of other folks, and she did an extremely good job. And really, everyone I talked to was thrilled that she was there, glad to finally hear her side of the story, and very sympathetic to her and to all of the things that she went through in supporting Lori, as you would if you didn't know what had happened. And like she said, she went on 2020 and it didn't go so well, because they didn't really know what had happened. The kids were still missing, and they couldn't, in their wildest dreams, wrap their brains around the idea that Lori could hurt her children. And so, like any other sister, she and her mom stood up for Lori and said, this can't have happened. And of course, then we're proven wrong, and that was hard. If you remember, in the Netflix series Sins of Our Mother, Janice did come on and talked at length about her feelings after she found out the children were discovered in Chad's yard. So everyone was very supportive of Summer, and I'm glad that she was able to do that. So Nate Eaton, CrimeCon does put their content out at some, and they will at some point. Some of it is subscription based, so you may have to pay for it if you really want to see her CrimeCon presentation. But after she was done, she did an interview with Nate Eaton, and it is on East Idaho News. And I think she probably covered a lot of what she covered in her talk. She did she did talk at length. I'm sorry, I was getting things turned around. She did talk at length about how she feels now and about that awful telephone call with Lori that was played in court. So let's jump into the trial. So the first defense witness was Emma Daybell, Chad's daughter. And it was kind of sad. When we first saw Emma on some of the local news stations when the kids were still missing and she was driving by making faces at all the media, her hair was short and dark and she looked an awful lot like her mother. She now has long hair and it is very light blonde. And she looks more like Lori than she does like her mother. And it's kind of sad. She was one who came on and said Tammy was sick. Tammy was, I'm trying something new tonight, so bear with me. Emma talked a lot about her mom being sick, and this is a cute little video clip of an end of school video, and that is Tammy right there in the black and white stripes. I'm going to let it play one more time so you can see it. That's Tammy up there. And you can see she looks like she's having a lot of fun. She does not look like an introvert who never talks to anybody, and she doesn't look like she's on death's door. Now, I have to qualify this by saying I don't know when this was made. It's not dated, and I've seen a couple of conflicting reports of when it was made. So I can tell you, I can just say I don't know when it was made. But it was fun to see her having fun, and it's a much longer video. I just clipped part of it. So I thought it was nice to see her in a way that didn't put her on death's door or didn't make her look so pathetic. One of the things that Emma said was that she was the one who Googled from her parents' computer, South by Southwest wind. To me, this felt very contrived and fell flat. First of all, it was September. It was the day that Tylee's remains were disposed of on the property. So it was September 8th. And school's in session then. Emma's a teacher. So I don't know what that was all about. Why was she at Tammy and Chad's house? Had to be that morning. Why was she there, and why would she not be at work? So it was just, it was kind of strange. And school is in session in September in Rexburg. I checked, and they start back to school before Labor Day, so sometime in late August. So she'd already been back to work a couple of weeks by the time that search was done. She also made a comment. She said, she said her father was, somebody put 2014 there. So maybe that's when that video was made. That would be before they moved to Rexburg. I've seen that date, but I also saw somebody else say that it was more recent than that. So I don't really know for sure when that video clip was done. So she commented that although that her father was distraught the day that Tammy died, and although he may have not had romantic feelings for her, he cared about her, and it was difficult for him to see her die. That's the only inclination that we've gotten, that Chad was present and saw her die. So that was a little troubling. All in all, I wasn't really sure that Emma added that much to Chad's defense. It seemed pretty contrived, pretty scripted, and she was incredibly robotic. At one point, John Pryor says, "I want to talk about the day that your mother died. And if you need a Kleenex or you need to stop, please let me know." And she's like, "No, I'm fine." And she was just deadpan. Garth was very much the same way. So the next witness was Garth, Chad's oldest son. He talked about Tammy Daybell getting winded and fainting if she got up after kneeling. I wanted to point out that this is common. I have had this most of my life, and as I've gotten older, it's certainly gotten more evident. It happens when you stand up quickly and your blood pressure doesn't compensate fast enough, and you can get a little dizzy. It happens to a lot of people. Doesn't really mean anything about a person's overall health. I mean, world-class athletes have it. So it wasn't, I wasn't really all that convinced. So he commented that at one point he was called before the grand jury. Now, if you've been following this case a long time, you may remember that after Chad and Lori were initially indicted for the murders, there was a second grand jury that was called into session. It's not clear, and it wasn't clear from his testimony, whether it was the same jury pool, the same jury panel, or a new one. I suspect, because most of the time prosecutors want to keep the same jury panel, I suspect it was the same group of jurors. They were called back in. What came out at trial was that the grand jury called Garth because they had questions. So according to Garth, now it's interesting because John Pryor also called the attorney that advised Garth when he was called before the grand jury. Now, attorneys are not permitted with witnesses in grand jury. So all he could do was sit in the hall and be available if Garth had any questions. So he wasn't in the room where it happened. That's a Hamilton joke. So Garth insisted that he was called before the grand jury, and that the grand jury told him that he was going to be indicted unless he changed his story, and that he was under a great deal of pressure to change his story. That kind of falls a little flat because he didn't change his story and he wasn't indicted. So you got to wonder how much of that it doesn't necessarily hold water, right? I think probably the most interesting part of it, and it was not good for Chad, was that Garth once again said he was working his second job as a scare character at the local haunted house. Now, this is October 19th, so still a little bit early in the season. Okay. And he's working as a scare character at the haunted mill. And when there's nobody coming through, they sit around and shoot the breeze. And so he said the haunted mill closes somewhere between 12:30 and 1, and that he got home about 1:30. He came in, he walked down the hall, he saw his parents bedroom door was open. He looked in, and he could see two forms in the bed and hear Chad snoring. And he said he went to his room. He got on his computer and watched videos until about 3:30 and went to sleep. He woke up. He said possibly he heard a thump, and then he heard his dad calling his name and saying he needed help. He rushed in. His mom was half out of the bed with her feet still tangled in the sheets, and he lifted her up and put her back on the bed. Now, as a rebuttal witness, the prosecution called the guy he worked with, who was in the scare room next door, and who he spent a lot of time chit-chatting with when there was nobody coming through the haunted house. This young man's name is Kay Abeglin. Quite a name, Kay Abeglin. And Kay said he didn't recall, or I don't know that he was asked when the haunted house closed on the 19th. However, he said a week or so later, when Garth came back to work, he offered his condolences and asked, "Oh man, what happened?" And Garth told him that he found Tammy out of bed when he got home that night, and that his father was missing. Now, we need to talk about these text messages, because this came out. It actually came out from the expert that the defense called. So I'm just going to pull this up. I hope it is. I think that's as big as I can make it, because I'm still learning these things. But it's really interesting if you look at, and I'm going to have to get up close and personal in order to read this. So this time frame goes from, I don't know if you can see my pointer or not, but it goes from 6:15 p.m. to 8:24 p.m. There were 6 texts between Lori and Chad. Between 6:56 and 8:24, there were 6 texts between Lori and Alex. At 8:44, Alex sent Chad a text. Then from 8:47 to 9:04, there are 12 texts between Lori and Alex. At 8:52, there is, I got to move my camera, 1 text to Lori from Chad. And then at 8:35, Chad sends Alex 1 text. Now, here's where it gets kind of interesting. Between 9:59 and 11:12, Lori and Zulema exchange 11 texts. At 10:07, Alex arrives at the LDS church 2.6 miles from Chad's home. He parks his car in the parking lot. Now, we can only assume that he left his phone in his car, and either walks or Chad picks him up. Probably walks, looking at the timeline, because between 10:12 and 10:25, they exchange 4 texts, probably while Alex is walking that 2 miles. At 10:22, Tammy's phone shows that she's still playing games. She's playing games on her phone. Then 10:23, between 10:23 and 10:54, there are 10 texts between Chad and Alex. Then at 10:28, 11:28, between 10:54 and 11:28, their phones go dead. Nobody does anything. Then at 11:28, a single image is deleted from Tammy's phone. Nobody knows what that image is. It just shows that it was deleted. Between 10:34 and 10:35, Chad and Alex exchange 2 texts. And then at 10:46, Alex leaves the church. So either Chad took him back or he walked back to the church. Now, at that point, he leaves the church and he drives not to his apartment, but to Idaho Falls to stay in a hotel. Don't ask me why, but he goes to Idaho Falls and checks into a hotel there. Now, this time period, this 11:53 to 12:09, he makes a voice call to Lori, which sounds to me like he's talking to her while he's driving to the hotel. And then he gets there, he gets off the phone with Lori. It's about the right time for to get from Chad's to the hotel. And then at 12:10, Lori sends Zulema a text. And then at 12:55, Chad sends Lori a text. So reading between the lines, this looks very much like Alex parked at the church, left the phone in his car, either walked or Chad picked him up, brought him down to the house. They killed Tammy, and then Alex either walked or Chad took him back to his car. Now, the reason this is interesting or significant, I should say, is because of what McKay Abeglin says. Now, this is the kid who was working with Garth. And a week after Tammy's death, Garth tells McKay, when I got home, my mom was on the floor, cold, and her lips were blue. And I put her back on the bed, and I couldn't find my dad. He wasn't there. So this makes me wonder, did they get out early at the haunted mill? Because McKay said that sometimes they closed early if there wasn't a lot of traffic coming through. And it was still early, really, in the season. So it's possible that they closed early. So then you got to ask, did Garth really come in and watch videos and go to sleep? Or did he come in, find Tammy half out of the bed with her feet wrapped in the sheet, put her back in bed, and then say to his dad, when his dad showed up, where in the heck have you been and what in the heck has happened? Then we have to ask, was he taking Alex back to his car? Was he going to dispose of Tammy's body in a way that he couldn't do because Garth came home? There's a lot of questions there, but it certainly calls into question Garth and Chad's story, and you begin to understand why the grand jury had questions. So, lots of questions. So the next person they called was Joe Murray. That is Emma's husband. Now, Joe was a little prickly at times with everybody, with John Pryor, and definitely with the defense. At one point, he was complaining that the police were still driving by the property. He didn't like Hermosillo. He didn't like that they were driving by the property after the children's bodies were found. He didn't see any reason for them to do it. And Rocky Whitson at one point said, well, you're not a law enforcement agent or law enforcement officer, are you? And Joe's answer was, no, I'd rather be anything but a law enforcement officer. So the one thing that came out that I thought was significant was he said the first time he met Lori Vallow was the day after Tammy's funeral at Chad Daybell's house. So then the defense had some, the defense called Regan Price. She was their neighbor. She lived next door to Joe and Emma, and Joe and Emma lived kitty corner from a kitty corner across the corner from from Tammy and Chad. I don't know why John Pryor called her. She got on the stand and she said, yes, I heard a gunshot from over there, but I can't remember when it was. So that wasn't particularly helpful. If John Pryor was trying to say, well, there was a gunshot because he shot a raccoon, but that could be double-sided because could have shot Tylee too. It was the same day. So, Regan Price's information was fairly pointless. The next person was Dr. Kathy Raven. She is a forensic pathologist. She's an expert witness from California. And she went through the analysis. She looked at the autopsy from Tammy Daybell. And she went through it and she said, this should not have been classified as a homicide. It should have been classified as undetermined. And you may remember that there are a handful of categories of ways that deaths are classified. They can be natural causes, they can be suicide, they can be homicide, undetermined. She opined that it was improperly identified as a homicide. It should have been identified as undetermined. However, she admitted that she had not looked at in all of the records that that Dr. Christensen, who was the Utah medical examiner, had looked at. She had not seen all the statements from witnesses. She had not seen the all of the information about, hang on here a minute. She had not been privy to a lot of the investigative reports, and John Pryor made a lot out of it, saying that it was confirmation bias, that Dr. Christensen believed that it was a homicide, and so he looked for evidence to support his theory. The prosecution recalled Dr. Christensen on rebuttal, and he once again went through it and said absolutely. One of the interesting things, which was bothersome to me, was that Dr. Raven didn't even mention the pink foam, which was bloody sputum that was a result of the asphyxiation. So what Dr. Christensen said was that when someone gets asphyxiated, it causes this edema in the lungs, and that it's foamy, and usually because little capillaries in the lungs burst, it's blood tinged. And so he said he found that in Tammy's lungs, even though she had been embalmed. He found the residue of that foamy sputum in her lungs. And of course, there were reports that it was dribbling out of her mouth after she was dead. So John Pryor was like, they just sort of skirted around that finding, and that was troubling to me because it really was a substantial piece of what Dr. Christensen based his determination on. So to me, it seemed a little disingenuous. I say, if you're going to bring an expert in who's going to refute the prosecution's expert, there better be a one-to-one correlation. You better bring somebody in who's really going to be able to look apples and apples and then and say this determination was wrong. I didn't think that Dr. Raven did that. And I didn't think that John Pryor did a good job of setting up his questions so that the jury could see that. So I didn't think that she was all that helpful. He also called Dr. Eric Bartelink, who is a fairly well-known forensic anthropologist. Now, you'll recall that the prosecution called an FBI expert that was a forensic anthropologist. Once again, his presentation was interesting, but I'm not really sure it did Chad any favors. What he said was he did say one thing that I kind of went over. Not that it really makes a huge amount of difference, but what he said was he believed that Tylee's body had been burned whole, that she was not dismembered. Now, the forensic anthropologist from the FBI would dispute that. But he also put up a diagram and showed that a substantial amount of Tylee's skeletal remains are missing. Now, who knows where they are? But they weren't recovered when her body was recovered. So that was disturbing. I presume that there were some pieces that hadn't been recovered, but I had no idea that it was maybe half or more of her body. He confirmed that there were sharp force traumatic injuries. He actually said that some of them appeared to be perimortem, that they were done at the time of death, that they weren't postmortem, which was troubling too. He painted a slightly different picture, and I think a worse one, of what potentially happened to Tylee. And he sure didn't do Chad any favors. He's very bright, and he was very articulate, and he was able to explain and really kind of show his work, if you will. But I did not think that he did Chad any favors. They called Asmir Keravic, as he pronounced it, very rolling his R's for the judge. He was an assistant AG. Now, if you remember, after Tammy died, and the children were still missing, and suspicions were raised, the Fremont County prosecutor at that time, her name is Marcia Murdoch. She was the Fremont County prosecutor. Well, she decided because of health problems, she wasn't going to run again. Her assistant prosecutor was running for her seat. And Lindsay Blake, who had grown up in the area and had been practicing in Utah, came back to town and ran against him and won. So when the Tammy Daybell case first started, Marcia Murdoch said, "We're a tiny little community. We do not have the ability to investigate this case." And she asked the Attorney General's office to take it over. So they were doing a fair amount of investigation before Lindsay Blake was elected, took office, and then said to the AG, "We want the case back." So during that time, these folks from the AAG's office, or the AG's office, were doing an investigation. So this Asmir Kararik is an investigator from the, sorry, I have a dog here, is an investigator from the AG's office. And he interviewed, now this is one of these things that didn't do anybody any favors, didn't really help John Pryor, but it was one of those, that's kind of juicy and kind of gee whiz, and but it really didn't do anybody any good. But what he said was he interviewed Melanie Gibb, and Melanie Gibb in her testimony had said, well, it was always Chad or Lori who told us who were dark and who were light and what have you. But in that interview, she told him that he was a really nice guy and that she could tell that he was light, and she could rate him, and he was on the light scale. So I understand why John Pryor may have wanted to bring that out, but I don't think it really added anything to his theory of the case. So he also called Rick Schmidt. He was a sheriff's officer, and it was another one that was just kind of silly. At one point, he said, we were handed shovels and told go find something. Later on, it was clarified by the case agent that they were told to go out and look for areas that were suspicious. They weren't told to dig anything. They were told to go out and try and identify suspicious areas when they first got on the property. They weren't exactly positive what they were looking for. They knew that there was something going on around the pet cemetery because that's where Alex's phone pinged. And they knew there was something going on under the tree, under JJ's tree, because that's where Alex's phone had pinged on the day that JJ was, the day after JJ was last seen. So, and the other thing was that John Pryor contended that they had used the tools out of Chad Daybell's shed to dig in the yard. And the case agent came back and said that is absolutely not true, that they brought a whole trailer full of equipment to use. And once those tools were identified, they were set aside as evidence. So the last, or actually second to last witness for the defense was Patrick Eller. He was a digital expert on cellular phone data and location data specifically. So there were two different kinds of data that came in from the phones. So the first thing is what's called a geofence. And this is a warrant that essentially says to Google, who does most of the geolocation data, we want you to give us within a 100-yard radius or a 20-yard radius of this particular point, satellite point, all cell phones that came through that. It's like a net. Anything within that circle, we want you to know during this particular time, we want to know who was within that area of interest. So they identified area around Chad Daybell's home and the times, and they sent the warrant to Google. So the next thing that happens is that Google then sends back an answer to the warrant. But what they do is they assign their own ID number to each user to keep the users anonymous, and they send all that data back to the requester. And then the requester goes through and tries to sort of winnow out what seemed to be the most likely users. So, of course, they knew Alex's number was going to be there. So they narrowed it down and they went back to Google and they said, we need to have you identify these people, these devices really that were within the geofence. However, what the prosecution witness testified to was that when they went back to Google, Google said, we'll give you the top 10. And they didn't give them all 19 of the devices that were identified to have been in that geofence during that time frame. Now, Patrick Eller said he'd never heard of that before. He's always been able to, he's always seen where they ask for identifying information for every user who was identified as being in the geofence. So that was the first part of it, was that Alex's phone was caught in the geofence on all 3 dates. The day Tammy died on October 19th, on September 8th, when Tylee's body was buried, and on September 23rd, when JJ's body was buried. So then John Pryor said to him, but where was Chad's phone? He says, well, Chad's phone didn't show up in any of these geofence warrants. He wasn't on his property on September 8th. He wasn't on his property on September 23rd, and he wasn't on his property on October 19th. Well, we know he was there on October 19th because he exchanged text messages with Alex and Lori, and we know he was there. So then the prosecution calls one of their bombshell witnesses. They recall Detective Stubbs, who was involved in the geolocation information. And they ask him about emails and about Google searches and emails that Chad Daybell did. The first thing is, in January, he Googled how to erase location data, how to turn off location data on an iPhone. John Pryor made a lot of the fact that he had an Android, but Lori Vallow had an iPhone. So then they ask, well, did you find anything else interesting? And he says, yes, I found that Chad Googled how to erase your location data and found out that you can request Google to delete your location data. And he did. And so let me get the dates right. Chad contacted Google on August 14th of 2019 and requested that his entire location history for the lifetime of his Google account be deleted. And on August 24th, all of that location data was deleted. And 2 weeks later, Tylee was murdered. So I mean, to me, that was stunning because that is such consciousness of guilt. I mean, I think that was the single piece of evidence that I was just like shook over, because I think that just closed. That was it. It was just the final nail. John Pryor's last witness was a DNA expert, Dr. Hempikian. Now, Dr. Hempikian is very well known throughout the country. He actually teaches at Boise State University here in Boise. And he teaches master's and PhD level DNA analysis. And he actually has a lab and they do process DNA. And he also teaches both in their criminal justice department and in their biology department. So he very much has this expertise that overlaps and works with law enforcement. He's very well thought of. So a lot of people, especially people who know of him from here in Boise, were very troubled that he was testifying for the defense. But when he testified, he certainly didn't add a lot to the defense. He was able to say, yes, it's very difficult to discover when DNA is deposited. So if you find DNA on something, you cannot figure out when it was deposited or how. Did it come from some bodily fluid? Is it touch DNA? Was it transfer DNA where I touched something and then touched something else and left DNA? I mean, there's a number of ways. I think that's one of the things that keeps coming up in the Kohberger case, is the only connection Brian Kohberger has is the snap on the knife sheath, the DNA that was deposited on the snap on the knife sheath. You know, now you have to sort of connect up the dots. The knife sheath was found underneath one of the victims. The victims were all stabbed to death with a knife that is similar to the one that fit the knife sheath. So there's a chain of circumstantial evidence beyond just the DNA. But he made the point, and it is true, that it's impossible to tell when DNA is deposited. So in the case of, you can say Alex Cox's fingerprint was in the tape that bound JJ. Probably that was deposited at the time that JJ was wrapped in tape. Lori Vallow's hair was found in that tape. It's impossible to say where that hair came from or when it was deposited. It could have been on Alex. It could have been on JJ's pajamas because he often slept in Lori's bed. I mean, it could have been gotten there a number of ways. So that was really indicative of nothing. And I didn't really feel at any point like Dr. Hempikian ever really helped the defense particularly. I don't think he hurt the prosecution. I think he said about the same things that the prosecution had said. But I don't think that he particularly helped the defense. So that was the close of the defense case. The jury was going to be sequestered, and we knew that. And so the judge then adjourned court on Thursday afternoon and gave everybody until Tuesday to come back. On Tuesday, they did closing arguments. I thought Lindsay Blake did a masterful job. I thought Lindsay Blake did a masterful job throughout the entire trial. I thought it was very clear that she was in charge of the prosecution, that she was the lead attorney, that she was calling the shots. I also thought it was very clear that she had a very clear narrative that she was working through. And I thought that each piece of evidence really built on that narrative. I thought she did a masterful job on closing. She used just enough video and pieces of evidence to remind the jurors of the things they had seen, to reinforce those things. And I thought that she put out a very cogent, very pointed, logical closing argument. John Pryor, on the other hand, had a little more trouble and did a little bit more of the shotgun approach. And I think we see that a lot in defenses because they really are literally the only thing that's left to them is to poke holes and raise reasonable doubt. And when that's the only defense, you find yourself doing this shotgun thing. So he started out by talking about, before I get there, I want to say this. the single most important thing in a trial is credibility. If you are standing up there in front of a jury, they have to find you credible because they have to trust you. You have to build a rapport and a trust with the jury. I'm not sure John Pryor ever really did that. And credibility is key to the jury finding the facts as you present them. I thought the prosecution did a really good job of coming across as very credible. For the most part, I felt that John Pryor did a good job of coming across as credible. He did a pretty good job in his cross-examination of staying on task and being credible, of not getting too strident or too argumentative, which is a risk. And I thought that even in his defense case, even though a lot of his witnesses weren't really particularly helpful, I thought that he did okay. But he really tortured his own credibility and undermined his own credibility in closing. And he did something which I thought was incredibly dangerous. First of all, he went on in closing and said, Lori Vallow was after Chad. She was after Chad the same way she went after Charles Vallow. She was after him. And when Alex Cox took a shot at, now see, first of all, he goes through the whole prosecution case, does all of his cross-examination, talking about how this gun that Tammy Daybell saw that somebody shot at her with was a paintball gun. He belabors it. He insists that it was a paintball gun. Joe Murray says he showed the cop. Tammy Daybell pulled up a picture of a paintball gun and they showed it to the cop. I mean, there's a really tortured effort to make sure that everybody thinks this is a paintball gun. Then he gets to closing arguments and he says, well, they weren't shooting at Tammy. They were shooting at Chad Daybell. They thought Chad Daybell drove that truck. And so they were shooting at Chad because they wanted Chad's life insurance. Never once in his defense did he ever put on anybody who said that Chad even had life insurance. Now, how do you make that argument? How do you make the argument that they were after Chad for his life insurance the same way as they went after Charles Vallow for his, and not prove that Chad had life insurance? It's just crazy. And I think that was the point that the jury said, okay, we're done. We no longer find this guy the least bit credible. I thought that his closing was kind of scattergun. He certainly absolutely threw Lori under the bus, so that's going to be interesting if they have any contact with one another. We don't know yet. So he wrapped up. Closing argument is supposed to be where you close the deal. Closing argument is supposed to be where you take all of the ribbons and you tie them up in a neat bow. And Pryor didn't do it. Now, I will say, I have said from the beginning, I don't know how John Pryor did this trial. I don't know how John Pryor did an 8-week trial alone without any other help. He had one investigator. He literally, I guarantee you, he was eating, sleeping, breathing when he slept this trial. He was just trying his very best to keep it all together. I do understand that by the time he got to closing arguments, he was exhausted. I cannot even explain to you the level of exhaustion. So I understand that he didn't finish strong. And that may have simply been a product of a grueling 8 weeks. I don't know. I haven't talked to John Pryor. I'd like to. I might try to, but I haven't yet. But his closing was basically, it was all Lori and Alex. It was all their fault. Chad was their next target. He was this poor, naive guy who didn't know any better and was this inexperienced guy, and he was just wrapped into this. So the jury goes back to deliberate, and they come back in 6 hours. This is less time than it took Lori Vallow's jury to come back with a guilty verdict. And they come back in 6 hours and they find him guilty on all charges. Now, I have to say, I was a little nervous about Tammy's charge, the charge for Tammy's death, because there wasn't any direct evidence. It was all very circumstantial evidence. And I think I was a little nervous whether or not the jury was actually going to connect those dots, but they didn't have any trouble at all. Now, if you want to know what the jury was thinking, Nate Eaton has done several interviews with several of the jurors. He did one interview with 6 of the jurors, and I think it was very enlightening, and good on Nate for getting that interview. Nate's been on it since the very beginning, and I think that he really he did a good job of interviewing the jurors, just as he did when he interviewed jurors from Lori's trial. It was interesting to hear the jury talk about what happened when they were sequestered. They were not allowed any electronic devices. They were not allowed, they couldn't have a remote control for their TV because they couldn't look at any news or anything online. They were allowed to have books or movies, but they had to be approved by the court. And they were sequestered in a hotel, and they were allowed to have one 10-minute phone call to family each day, but it had to be on speaker and a deputy had to be standing by. He said, they said it was exhausting. Being there, concentrating, listening, was exhausting. If you think it was exhausting for the jurors, you cannot even imagine the level of exhaustion an 8-week trial has on the attorneys. I am absolutely certain that Kay and Larry are exhausted as well, and probably are very happily home and taking lots of naps. I hope they are. The court has offered counseling to any of the jurors who felt that they might need it, and several of them said that they probably would take advantage of it. The jurors remarked that they were surprised at the far-reaching impact, that not only did this participating in this trial impact all of the people who were involved in the trial, from the lawyers and the law enforcement people and the families and all of that, but they realized that it had a far-reaching impact on their families and their coworkers, which I thought was a pretty aware kind of observation. They said, for most of them, that the text messages where Chad talked about, yes, there's a plan to take the children, was their breaking point, was their point when they said, that's it, he's guilty. And also that they were going to eliminate telestial obstacles. They said they very much saw Chad as the mastermind, and they thought that it was particularly telling that everyone in Chad's family was light, except for Tammy, and everyone in Lori Vallow's family were dark. I thought it was interesting that they said over and over again, how did they think they would never get caught? So we know, because we've seen other information they weren't presented with, that Lori and Chad honestly believed that the tribulation was going to start on July 21st of 2020. And the world was going to be in such chaos, nobody was going to be paying a bit of attention to where they were or what they were doing, or the fact that Lori's children were missing. Nobody was going to be paying any attention to two missing kids and Tammy Daybell's death. So, but they didn't know that. And they asked, a couple of times commented, how did they think they would never get caught? They said the victim, this was interesting. They said the victim impact statements were difficult for them to listen to. And one of them said, the only dry eye in the room was Chad's when the victim impact statements were being read. That's pretty telling for the jurors to say that. One of the jurors said, Chad's face never changed color. He never showed any emotion. He never flushed. He never, and there were no tears. And it was interesting because the jury said, at one point while they were talking about Tammy's death, he reached for a tissue, but he never could muster up a tear. And more than one person observed that as well. So they then Saturday morning, they came back with their verdict on the death penalty. Now, what we know is that since the death penalty was reinstated, originally the death penalty was found to be unconstitutional because judges were imposing it, and there was never an opportunity for a jury to determine whether there was any mitigating circumstances. And we're going to talk a lot about mitigation in just a second. So when people, when states started reinstating the death penalty, they reinstated it as this two-part process. First, a guilt or innocence phase. Then, if there's a guilty verdict, the jury then decides whether or not there are aggravating factors and mitigating factors, and whether the mitigating factors outweigh the aggravating factors. So that's what was presented to the jury for them to assess during the penalty phase. So typically what happens is the defense gets up and puts on a mitigation case. They call witnesses. They have people come and talk about what a great guy Chad is. They do all of that. And then the prosecution can bring in any additional information they have about the kind of person Chad is. In addition, the jury is instructed that everything that they heard in the guilt and innocence phase can be considered in the penalty phase. So they get up and give their opening statements, and the judge says to John Pryor, it's time for you to put on your mitigation case. And if you recall, that morning, before they started the penalty phase, they started much later than everyone expected. They didn't start at 8:30. It was more like 10 o'clock by the time they got started. Well, there was a reason for that. It was because the judge had a hearing outside the presence of the jury, and a sealed hearing where he took up the issue of whether or not there was going to be mitigation presented, and accepted a proffer, which is an offer of proof from John Pryor. And so there was that sealed hearing to deal with mitigation and a proffer. After that, then John Pryor said, we're not going to present. The judge said, I understand you're not going to present any mitigation evidence. So now I have a piece of a clip from the trial, which I'm going to try, and I'm I'm trying to master this technology for y'all. So let me share my screen and pull up this little bit.
Discussed this with you on the record already, but you have explained the right of mitigation and allocution to your client. Is that correct?
I have, Your Honor.
All right, Mr. Daybell, the purpose of these rights is to potentially present evidence to the jury that could result in them finding that the death penalty should not be imposed in your case. Do you understand that?
I do.
All right, and I'm also advised then that you do not intend to, despite the preparation of mitigation from your attorney, you don't intend to present that evidence at this hearing. Is that your choice?
That is my choice.
Has anyone coerced or pressured you personally to make that choice?
No.
And do you feel like you're thinking clearly this morning as you make that choice?
Yes.
Okay, well, that is your right, Mr. Daybell. So thank you for putting that on the record for the court before we brought the jury.
Now, I'm going to play this again. I want you to watch John Pryor's body language. I know this isn't huge on the screen, but watch John Pryor's body language. First of all, you can see he's seething. He's turned away from Chad. Watch how he passes the microphone over to Chad. He is not happy because Chad has just tied his hands. He cannot present any mitigating information. You hear the judge say, you're not allowing your attorney who has prepared mitigation, has prepared a mitigation case, you're not allowing your attorney to present it. And Chad says that's right. So let me play this again, because I do want you to watch John Pryor's body language.
And at this time then, we are going to Mr.
Okay, this is going to
Pryor,
start over
I've
again.
discussed this with you on the record already, but you have explained the right of mitigation and allocution to your client. Is that correct?
Now watch
I have, Your
Pryor.
Honor.
All right, Mr. Daybell, the purpose of these rights
He doesn't
is
even
to
look at
potentially
him. He
present
just
evidence to the jury that could result in them
puts the
finding that the death
microphone
penalty
over in
should
his
not be imposed
direction.
in your case.
He's
Do you understand
mad.
that?
I do.
All right, and I'm also advised then that you do not intend to, despite the preparation of mitigation from your attorney, you don't intend to present that evidence at this hearing. Is that your choice?
That is my choice.
Has anyone coerced or pressured you personally to make that choice?
No.
And do you feel like you're thinking clearly this morning as you make that choice?
Yes.
Okay, well, that is your right, Mr. Daybell. So thank you for putting that on the record for the court before we brought the jurors in. At this time then, we are going to Mr. Pryor. I've discussed this with you on the record already, but you have.
So what I find really interesting about that is John Pryor is furious. You can just see it on his face. His face is really tight and tense. He's turned away from Chad. At one point, he just pushes the microphone over toward him. He is not happy. So what can we make of this? Why would Chad Daybell decide not to put any mitigation on? Well, it's a little mystifying, but I have some thoughts. First of all, I think that John Pryor did the right thing by presenting information to the judge and making a proffer of what he would present in mitigation, because that covers him from anyone saying he committed malpractice or it was ineffective assistance of counsel for him not to present mitigation. He was there, prepared, ready to put on a mitigation case. His client did not allow him to do that. He was not happy. So what can we make of this? Why would Chad Daybell decide that? Well, I think one thing was that the only people who were going to come and speak on his behalf were his children. So he was going to have to put Emma and Garth back on the stand and have the prosecution have another shot at them. And I don't think, and remember that the rules are less strict for these sorts of, not in terms of the rules of evidence, but the rules are less strict in this portion. The jury is allowed to consider sympathy and and consider the emotional impact. In fact, they're invited to consider the emotional impact, both on the families, both on the victims, and on the defendant. It's right there in the instructions that the judge gives during the mitigation phase, or during the penalty phase. So why did he pull punch at the last minute? Well, I think it was because he didn't want to have to put Garth and Emma back on and give the prosecution another shot at them, and perhaps a more pointed shot at them. And I think that he felt, and this is purely speculation on my part because I don't know any more than you do. I'm just trying to read the tea leaves. I think that he felt that the mitigation phase was not going to go in his favor, and that it would give the defense yet another opportunity to paint him as a bad guy and to paint Lori and bring in more information about Lori. So I think that was the reason why, because the information about Lori's conviction would have come in during the penalty phase. The information about Lori's, the charges being levied against Lori would have come out during mitigation or during the penalty phase. So I think that he just decided he was going to get the death penalty anyway, and he was not going to put his kids and anybody else that was going to be called on his behalf through it. And I think that was his decision. If I'd been John Pryor, I would have been mad too, because John Pryor wasn't allowed to do his job, and his job was to do his very best to save Chad Daybell's life, and he wasn't allowed to do it. And that's frustrating, especially when you've been living this case for 5 years, and since 2021, so for 3.5, 4 years. And you have put your blood, sweat, and tears literally into the case. So I thought that was likely why he made that decision. No, I don't think that it becomes an appellate issue. I think a lot of people think or speculated that perhaps it would become an appellate issue. And the reason it would become an appellate issue is because Chad somehow wasn't allowed to give his mitigation evidence. And it's very clear from the record that he had every opportunity to give his mitigation evidence. So I don't think that, I think that's a non-starter. Do I think that perhaps he would have an ineffective assistance of counsel argument because John Pryor didn't have any help? I don't think so. I think John Pryor did a really good job. Let's remember how you get to an ineffective assistance of counsel finding on appeal. You first have to prove that the outcome would have been different but for your attorney's poor showing, or poor job. And that is a really high bar to meet. There are cases going back years where the defense attorney fell asleep and the judge said, well, no harm, no foul, because it would have been found guilty anyway. And so that's what you're up against when you appeal on ineffective assistance of counsel. So I think that's a non-starter, really. I don't know what the basis of appeal is going to be for Chad. Now, I think in Lori's case, she has a couple of colorable arguments. That's, arguments you don't have to put a bag over your head to make. So I think she's got a couple of those arguments. One being the delay outside of her speedy trial rights. That's a big deal. 41 days beyond her speedy trial deadline, that one is skirting an appellate issue. And I've said that from the beginning. So where she may have a colorable argument, I'm not sure that Chad is going to have a decent argument. that he was wrongly convicted. And I think that it was very clear that the jury didn't believe him. They believed he was the mastermind. They believed he thought he was all that in a pound of peas. And I believe that the jury thought that he was, that it was done very intentionally and for money, sex, and power. So Lindsay Blake was right. One other thing that I want to address, because I've seen it going around on social media, and I want to tell you my impression. Some people said when Chad, and I didn't pull this clip, but go back and take a look at it. When the judge sentenced him, now what happened was the jury came back, they answered all of the questions. They said, yes, there were aggravating factors as it related to Tammy. Yes, there were aggravating factors as it related to Tylee. Yes, there were aggravating factors as it related to JJ. No, there were no mitigating factors that outweighed the aggravation and made it unjust to impose the death penalty on every one of those 6 counts. So he got 6 death sentences. The judge also sentenced him right then and there in the 2 insurance fraud charges as well. The judge imposed 15 years on each one. He said those would run concurrent, which is at the same time, and they would run at the same time as his death penalty sentence. So they quite summarily carted him off to the Department of Corrections, and he is currently at the maximum security prison outside of Boise in a community called Kuna, which is literally up the road from me. So that is where he is. He will be on death row along with a handful of, I think there are 7 other inmates on death row, including 1 woman. And he is currently on death row, and that's where he will remain until either his sentence is commuted for some reason, overturned on appeal, or he receives a death warrant. The state of Idaho reinstituted the firing squad as a potential execution method if the drugs cannot be acquired to do lethal injection. And that law came into effect before his conviction. So he could be executed by the firing squad. Had Lori been still subject to the death penalty, she would not have been liable to use the firing squad because her conviction came after or before that change was made. And it's kind of a notice issue. You have to have notice of what the potential penalties are, and that includes the method of execution. So the people who are on, Chad is the only person on death row right now who could be executed by firing squad because he's the only conviction since the rule changed. So to get back to the close of the trial, at the point that the judge said, thank the jurors for their service, and said we're adjourned. And the bailiff said, all rise, and everybody stood up, and Chad sort of hesitated and stayed seated. A lot of people said he did that out of disrespect, and I don't believe that for a moment. But here's what I will say. Once a person is convicted, and I want y'all to remember back to the Adelson case. Once Charlie Adelson was convicted, he came back into the courtroom. They'd taken his tie, and he was shackled, okay? He was on suicide watch, and he was now a convicted murderer, and he was shackled. Now, I can tell you, because I was in the courtroom, that initially when Lori was at Lori's trial, It was a little harder to see with Chad, but I think it started out the same way. With Lori's trial, the first week, she came in ankle shackles and belly chains. They would unhook her hands, but her feet remained shackled, and those shackles were bolted to a ring bolt in the floor. That was one of the reasons why they moved that the defense table so it was directly facing the jury. The other, of course, was so the jury had a clear view of the defense. But he was bolted to the floor. Once a person is found guilty, their status changes, and law enforcement changes the way they're treated. So Chad was bolted to the floor. I think that when he attempted to stand up, he was caught up there. I've also talked before about the fact that a lot of times defendants wear a device on their leg, and it is like a leg brace that locks, and it's so they can't run. And they have to reach down and manually push a lever that releases that so they can bend their knee. I don't know which of those things was going on, but I do know that he was restrained and that he did not stand up because he was restrained. And I think any other speculation about him being defiant or disrespectful, I don't believe that. I don't think it's accurate. And having watched the entire trial, I don't believe that's something Chad would do. He's a jerk. I mean, he's a narcissist, and he believes he's right, but I don't believe that he would do that. He's too much of a Boy Scout. And I don't believe that he did it because he was disrespecting the court or the jury. I believe, and I think if you watch the very end of it, he sort of tries to stand up and then he kind of sits back down, and then the deputy kind of says something to him like, it's okay. So I think it's very obvious that his restraints just wouldn't let him stand up. So that's all I have to say about that. A lot of people are asking, what next? I am going to do my best to catch up on the Karen Reed trial because I would love to talk a little bit about that. I think it's fascinating. I think that I think it is one of the few trials we have seen in a long time where there is reasonable doubt that you can drive a bus through, and that's cool. I'm really excited about trying to get caught up on that. So yes, we're going to get caught up on some of the trials that we have not been covering because we've been Daybell wall to wall. I'm going to be doing a few things to get ready for the book to come out in September, but that's pretty much on its way. It feels a little bit like a birth on a baby, so I'm very excited. It's just about going to be out in the world. But we're going to catch up on some other cases. I'm super interested in Donna Adelson's case down in Florida, and also very interested in the Delphi case. That's another one that's got some really interesting legal issues and some reasonable doubt issues. So we're going to be looking at those as we go forward, because we're not going to have Chad to talk about anymore. Chad and Lori are both where they belong. So with that, I'm ready to take some questions. I have seen that Jen has been starring questions like mad as we've been going along. So hopefully we can answer some questions. Thank you very much for your time, good Lori. Hi, Dawn Shackelford. Enjoyed the evening here with you. Have a great week. Thank you, Dawn. So nice of you to be here. Carrie, and one more question. Will the communications between Rob Wood and Melanie Gibb become an issue on appeal? I don't think so, but I don't know. I think that there was an awful lot of communication going on. And I don't know what the basis of that communication was, but I would like to know. For those of you who are curious, I have not stopped wanting to get those sealed documents. And I am going to continue to file Freedom of Information Act and motions to get those things unsealed. That piece is not done yet. I'm not done with that. So you can count on me to be working on that. And it's highly possible that when the paperback version of the book comes out, there could be an update because I'm not done with that yet. So I don't know whether those will become an issue or not. I think it's very suspicious that they had all those communications, and I would love to see them all. Nirmala Visarjan. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm probably just massacred that. I'm very sorry. Can defense attorneys advise their clients to plead guilty? If so, do you think John Pryor advised Chad to do that? Thank you so much for pre-ordering the book. I appreciate that. So here's what I know. Having been a defense attorney for 30 years, I can tell you that there is always a plea offer. I have heard, although I can't substantiate this, but it rings true to me, that plea offers were made to Chad. And the plea offers were open until pretty close to trial. He had opportunities to plead guilty. He chose not to. I would be absolutely shocked if the prosecution did not offer him the same sentence Lori Vallow got. It would make no sense for them to say, no, we're going to go forward and get the death penalty against Chad. We all know that the death penalty takes forever and that people often die in prison before the death penalty is carried out, an execution is carried out. They die of natural causes in jail. So, and the expense of a death penalty trial, they'd already spent $4 million on Lori's, on the whole case before Lori's trial ever started. You've got to know that there was at least another $1 million worth of spent on her trial. And then we have Chad's trial on top of it. That's probably another $4 million. So you're not going to tell me that the prosecutors wanted the death penalty so bad that they were willing to saddle their citizens with that. That's just not being good stewards. And I can't see them doing it. So I'm certain that he was offered the same sentence as Lori and turned it down. And everything I have heard is that he wouldn't plead. He was determined that it was going to be all or nothing. Well, it was all. So, good question. Will Emma or Garth be charged with perjury? I doubt it. In order to charge someone with perjury, you have to be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that they lied. And I don't know what the state gets out of it at this point. You know, I mean, you have to think about those things. The prosecution is going to have to look at it and say, these people are in many ways victims too. They have been manipulated by Chad Daybell. They have lived their life in Chad Daybell's bubble. They have been raised with it. They believe it. What good would it do? Maybe they could prove that Emma and Garth both perjured themselves, but they have to ask, what does it accomplish? Does it accomplish anything that keeps the community safer? Is it a good use of public funds? What good would it serve? So, you know, if I were a prosecutor, I wouldn't pursue it. I would think I would allow the community to close the book and to start to heal. I think that's important. So, I suppose they could be, but I don't see it. They would have to have some really ironclad evidence that they lied. And it's got to be more than, we just think you're not telling the truth. There's got to be receipts. Barbara B. Chad is required to make monetary restitution. Will some of his commissary funds be garnished towards that end? Yes, a percentage of a person's commissary money, it does go to restitution. Now, what the judge said was he was hesitant to impose any further financial obligations like fines or attorney fees or costs or any of those things because of the tremendous restitution judgment. So, but the judge did order a restitution judgment for the insurance for $400, and said he was going to. Let's put it that way. I haven't seen a judgment, but the judge did say he was going to order restitution to the insurance company in the sum of $430,000. Now, is Chad ever going to be able to pay that? Absolutely not. He doesn't even own his house anymore. John Pryor owns it. And Emma is still living in it, according to her testimony. And we don't know. There's no money anywhere. So nobody's getting any money. Idaho has a slayer statute, so Chad Daybell cannot profit from his crimes. And he also can't, John Pryor couldn't say, give me rights to write a book in lieu of attorney fees, because that would be Chad profiting off of his crimes. So I don't know where the money is going to come from, but yes, his $30 a week will be, that he's allowed, will be garnished, I think 10%. So $3 a week will go towards his restitution. Yeah. Hi, Ladybug Lady. Hope your ladybugs are busy this spring. A lot of jurors felt Pryor was unprofessional. Do you feel this will affect his career in a negative light? Not really, and I didn't feel that Pryor was unprofessional. He has a different style and demeanor, certainly different than I would have been in trial. I thought that Lindsay Blake, on the other hand, was very professional. And I thought that as the trial went on, when she was talking, like when she was talking to victims during their victim impact statements, I thought her voice sounded very compassionate. I thought she did a very good job. John Pryor is just kind of a different breed of lawyer. I don't know. I didn't hear from the jurors in the interview that I listened to that they felt that he was unprofessional. It may have been. He's just a different breed. So he's older. He's, comes from that kind of, he's sort of a grown-up yuppie. I'm sure when he was first practicing, he had a fancy watch and a sports car. I mean, he's that generation. So I didn't think that he did anything particularly inappropriate. I think he's abrasive sometimes. And I think that he's of that generation that can't help but be sort of misogynistic. And, he is who he is. We'll see. I don't think that he did anything inappropriate. He's certainly not. And I don't believe that this will have an impact on his career. And I think he's got some ground to make up because he's been working for free for the last few months. So good questions, guys. Jane Blackbird. Can defense attorneys have their clients sign off on not presenting any mitigating factors and allocution, I think is what he meant. So the defendant can't claim ineffective assistance of counsel. No. Certainly, and you saw from John Pryor's demeanor, he was not happy at not being able to put on his mitigation case. So no, that is just not something that would happen. Clients can't sign off on not presenting mitigation, so they can't claim ineffective assistance. And as I've said, ineffective assistance is hard to prove because you first have to prove that the outcome of the case would have been different had it not been for your lawyer's incompetence. So, you know, you've got to be able to say, well, if my lawyer hadn't been incompetent and hadn't overlooked all of this exculpatory information, then I would have been found not guilty. I don't see that in Chad's case. I just don't. And so I don't think Pryor's been ineffective, and I don't think an appeal based on ineffective assistance is going anywhere. But that's my opinion. But that's what y'all watch for, is for me to be sassy. Can Pryor write a book on his own and keep the cash? Yes, he can. But Chad has to waive his attorney-client privilege. Now, you might remember back in the Jodi Arias case, Kurt Nurmi wrote a actually 2-volume book about representing Jodi Arias. He was disbarred because he revealed attorney-client privilege, attorney-client confidences in his book. So John Pryor better be ready to retire if he's going to write a book. Because I think that if he writes a book and tries to continue to practice, he's on dangerous ground. Because what people want to know are the things that he talked to Chad about that are covered by attorney-client privilege. And even with a waiver from Chad, I think he's on really dangerous ground if he does that. I sure as heck wouldn't do it. So, which reminds me, on a completely unrelated note, I just got confirmation from the state of Oregon that my law license has been reinstated so I can do pro bono work. So I am excited to be able to try and do some pro bono defense work. And hopefully do a little bit of work maybe with the Oregon Innocence Project. So, any other questions? I know, I see there's starred questions up there, so there's got to be more. Kiara, pretty name. Do you think JJ's death was the night David Warwick and Melanie Gibb were there to implicate them? No, I don't think that she did it on purpose to implicate them. I don't see that. The reason I say that is because she didn't implicate them. She didn't point the finger at them. John Pryor said, you know, I think it's sort of fishy that they were there, and I think they know more than they say. And I think it's kind of fishy that nobody got their cell phones and figured out whether they were in the mix. But I don't think that Lori's desire was to implicate them, because she didn't, and she would have had every reason to if she was trying to set them up to be implicated. We didn't see it. We didn't see it in her trial, so I can't imagine that she and Alex were trying to make it look like they were implicated. Good question, though. Will you cover Charles and Brandon's trial and any chance Melanie Pulaski gets charged? Great question, Dawn. Yes, I absolutely will cover Charles and Brandon's trial. I don't know yet whether I'm going to go to Arizona. Y'all know I'm in the process of moving. That's going to happen in early July, back to Central Oregon. And so there's a lot of upheaval going on in my world. Her trial starts in early August. I don't know whether I'm going to go to Arizona for that trial or not. There's a couple other trials that I'm really interested in that I might want to travel to instead, but we'll see. Her trial starts August 8th down there, and I expect it's going to be live streamed. If it's not going to be live streamed, then I would think twice about it. But I expect it is going to be. So if it's live streamed, I might go, for a small portion of it, just to kind of go and get the sense of what the Arizona court's like, but I don't think I would go for the whole trial. But I'm very happy to hear that the state of Arizona, in spite of everything, is going forward with these charges and are not cutting her a bunch of slack, because I think Charles Vallow deserves justice. And I think that Kay Woodcock is not really going to feel like this chapter can be closed until Charles receives justice too. And Brandon was shot at, but he also got a $12 million defamation judgment against the lawyers, the California lawyers. So, but he deserves justice as well. Lisa K. Jones, Jen Lynn, please, if she knows, explain D-Row. So many people are saying he will just be in regular prison until they give him his death warrant. I'm under the impression that they would have I see what you're saying. D-Row, like other prisons. I've always understood the death warrant meant your clock is ticking. That is right. So there is a separate portion of the prison where prisoners who are sentenced to death are housed. They are housed in a separate section of the prison. The rules around what they can and can't do are different. They are not in general population. I'm sure there are a number of reasons for that, including that they don't want them to get killed while they're in general population before the state can do it for them. So they also are much more restricted in who can visit and the communications that they have with the outside world. So I do not believe that he and Lori will be able to communicate except perhaps by letter. That may change. A lot of it is going to depend. Right now, Lori's in Arizona, and I don't believe that he can have any contact with her in Arizona. Everything that I have heard is that she did know, she was told, in fact, Summer said she talked to Lori, and Lori did know that he'd been found guilty, but Summer didn't know whether Lori knew he'd been, the death penalty had been found. So, but I suspect her lawyers would tell her. I'm sure her Arizona lawyers were sort of keeping her up to date on what was happening in Idaho because the cases are so closely related. He will be segregated from general population. They're very closely supervised when they have contact with other inmates, and they're in a separate section. So I don't know if once Lori is back in Idaho, whether or not they will permit them to have contact, and to what level. Certainly everything will be monitored and recorded, but I don't know what, if any, contact they'll be allowed to have now that they're both convicted. So good questions. Go Diana. Hi, Jen. I sent an email to Lori about the video by PD Questions, where he speculates that Chad might appeal on the grounds of his defense being unconstitutional. A lot of people have been discussing that. Yeah, I don't see it, and believe it would be great to have Lori's take on it. Okay, so I don't see it, and I don't see him as setting it up. So here's what we know. We know that when in the late 70s, early 80s, when the death penalty was found to be unconstitutional and states then began reinstituting it, a lot of states put it on the ballot, and there were ballot measures, and it was reinstituted. At that point, to answer the piece that the US Supreme Court found unconstitutional, they had to come up with this bifurcated process. They had to come up with the guilt and innocence and the penalty phase. And the penalty phase had to be decided by a jury. That was the piece, okay? The fact that Chad Daybell, on the record, waived his right, waived his ability to put on mitigation, I think negates any appellate claim that he might have. I don't think it's an appellate issue because a jury found the verdict. A jury returned the verdict. A jury did the deliberation that the US Supreme Court said had to be present. The deliberation had to be, were there aggravating factors? Were there mitigating factors? Did the mitigating factors make the imposition of the death penalty unjust? That was the analysis that had to happen, and the jury did that. The fact that Chad Daybell willingly, voluntarily chose not to put a case on, I don't believe is an appellate issue, particularly since we know that there was a sealed proceeding where John Pryor made his offer of proof, his proffer. That's proof offer, okay? It's a portmanteau, that's what it is, word. And so we know that he made his proffer on the record in a sealed proceeding and told the judge, if I were able to put on my mitigation evidence, here's what I would put on. I would call this witness, they would say this. I would call this witness, they would say this. I would call this witness, they would say this. And the judge then said, Mr. Daybell, you've heard all that offer, and you still don't want to put on a mitigation case. That's right, Your Honor. So I don't think I don't think you get there. It's like saying, I tied my lawyer's hands and now I want to claim ineffective assistance of counsel. It's just like Lori saying, I had ineffective counsel because I wouldn't let them throw Chad under the bus. I wouldn't let them claim mental health. It's the same argument. You can't tie your lawyer's hands, say you can't do that, and then the appellate court say, oh, you're right, it was a mistake. I mean, perhaps, and I want to say, I don't think this flies, but I suppose if I'm racking my brain for an argument, the argument would be the judge didn't have the authority to let Chad waive mitigation. But I think the judge did have the authority to do that. And Chad had the right to waive it. And the judge had the right to accept his waiver and let him do that. I think they were both well within their rights and their authority. So I don't see it as an appellate issue. And it would be foolish to as a lawyer, it would be foolish to say to Chad, hey, here's the strategy. You waive your mitigation, and then it's going to be an appellate issue, and the whole thing's going to get thrown out, and the whole thing's going to get your whole case is going to be overturned, because that's not going to happen. And it would be malpractice for a lawyer to advise a client to do that. So I don't see it. I don't see that that's anything that John Pryor would do. I don't see that it's anything that Judge Boyce would do. And frankly, I don't think Chad's smart enough to have thought of it. So no, I don't think that it was setting up an appellate issue. That would be way out there, particularly since the judge was so careful. Do you understand the rights you're giving up? And we don't know what went on in the sealed hearing, but that's what a proffer is. So, when the judge comes out and says, Mr. Pryor, you've made your proffer, he's making his record. He's covering his butt so that he's not going to get accused of committing malpractice. He's not going to get accused of being ineffective counsel. So I do not think that John Pryor was ineffective in any way. He may have been unlikable, and the jury may not have found him professional, but that's not ineffective. That's not. Hi, Roz. Can there be grounds for appeal based on comments made by jurors in post-trial interviews? One juror found Pryor annoying on occasions. Nope. The judge gives the jurors the instructions that they are free to talk about the case. They are free to say anything they want. They are free to talk about to the media, and they are free to express their opinions. They have the First Amendment right to say whatever they want about their experience. They also have an unequivocal right to say nothing if they don't want to talk about it. So no, nothing that the jurors could say post-trial would be an appellate issue. Once the verdict came down and the sentence was imposed and the jury was released from their service, there's nothing they could say, even if they said, I hated John Pryor and I thought he was a total jerk, which I don't think anybody said. Yeah, they found him annoying sometimes. Okay. I think the jury was very thoughtful. Greg, I'll get to that question in just a minute. I thought the jury was very thoughtful. In the interview I saw, I thought they were quite, they thought long and hard about the decisions that they had to make. There was a comment that one of them made early on that they were surprised at how well that group of 18 strangers got along. And they made a comment about, you know, sometimes if you at work, we've all had those experiences where you meet somebody and they're not really your cup of tea, or, you know, they don't quite mesh with the group, but they didn't have that in their experience with the other jurors. But what that tells me is that they also understand that not everybody who is involved in the case and presented the case is going to be your cup of tea. That doesn't mean that, I mean, you can find them annoying, but that doesn't mean that you're going to blame their client for it. I didn't see that in the jury. So I don't think that was particularly a concern. Do I think that Chad is going to unalive himself? I think that is always a risk when someone is sentenced to life in prison or gets the death penalty. I think it is always a concern. I think that perhaps that concern gets less as time goes on and they adjust to being in prison. But I think early on, when you realize that prison is going to be your life for the rest of your life, it's noisy, it's chaotic, it's not a pleasant way to live your life. And I think that when people realize that that is going to be their reality for the rest of their lives, I think that many people consider that. Whether Chad will do that or not, I don't know. He doesn't strike me as the most courageous of men. So it makes me doubtful. But I mean, there is also the argument that because they believe in multiple probations and they believe in that they're all going to be together in the celestial kingdom, and that they are all forgiven and exalted in the celestial kingdom, that that would be a temptation. So I guess it cuts both ways, and that remains to be seen. Hi, Lisa. If Chad had a psychological evaluation, would that be available in FOIA documents? No, it is one of the types of documents that are not available under the Freedom of Information Act. They are medical and mental health records, particularly under HIPAA, would not be releasable. Even if they were done by a court-appointed psychologist. There are some circumstances where expert reports, if they're done because they're ordered by the court, can be disclosed, but that's more in a civil realm than it is in a criminal realm. For example, in a family law case, if you have a custody evaluation done and the evaluator makes a recommendation of who should have custody of the children, that often includes a lot of psychological, may include psychological testing, a lot of psychological evaluation. And that does sometimes become part of the court record. But psychological examinations in this situation, they are covered by the confidentiality rules, and they would not be released. I know we have more questions, and I'm going to stick around a little longer than usual tonight, and we'll try and answer as many as we can. Sharon Harry, is John Pryor death penalty qualified now? This is a good question. So the death penalty qualification that the state requires is that you serve as a second chair and then as a lead counsel on a death penalty case. Since he sort of jumped that square, I suspect that the state would death penalty qualify him if he applied. But he has not. He said early on that he chose not to be qualified through the state public defender's office. So I don't know at this point. It's a good question. Let me tell you, the state doesn't pay all that great. Of course, he didn't get paid all that great anyway from being privately retained, since he worked for free for a considerable amount of time. So I don't know. He probably could. But the way it works is that you actually have to make an application to the Office of Public Defender, and the Public Defense Commission has to approve you to be death penalty certified, so that you can take court-appointed death penalty cases. That does not keep him from taking death penalty cases on a retained basis. And, I think it's very possible that somebody can say, well, he's already tried this big public death penalty case. Certainly can't be any worse than my case can't be any worse than that one. And he tried that one. So I think it's very possible he could get retained in other death penalty cases. Whether he gets state certified to be appointed by the state, I don't know. Hi, Megan. Why didn't Chad divorce Lori if he was going to throw her under the bus the way he did? I don't know. Remember that these folks believe that they are married for time and eternity, meaning forever and ever, and that they will be together in the celestial kingdom. I do not know why he has remained married to her. I don't know. I suspected at one point, now under Idaho law, the marital privilege, let me spit it out here, that spouse can't be forced to testify against their spouse. And a lot of people misunderstand that marital privilege. It means that one spouse cannot be compelled to testify against their spouse. But that does not keep a spouse from testifying if they want to. So you can't be compelled to testify against your spouse, but that doesn't mean you don't ever have to, or that you can be kept from it if you choose to. So I speculated at one point, because the marital privilege in Idaho does not apply if it involves the child of one of the partners. So because it involved Lori Vallow's children, anything that was said between Chad and Lori, even though they were married, would come in, wouldn't be privileged. But I wondered whether or not communication between Lori and Chad might be privileged as it applied to Tammy. Anything that they might have said about Tammy's death after they were married. It didn't appear that anything came in that would have fallen under that exception. So I don't know. That would have fallen under that privilege, I mean. So I don't really know why Chad's continued to stay married to Lori. Maybe he loves her. I don't know. You know, you can love somebody and still tell your lawyer, yeah, do whatever you can to keep me out of, to spare me the death penalty. And it's possible Lori said the same thing. It's possible she said, tell your lawyer, you know, I've already been convicted. Tell him that, you know, throw me under the bus if you have to, if it'll spare your life. So I don't know. I don't know the dynamics of that relationship at all, but I certainly could see all of those possibilities. Jan Garner, hi. Did I understand that Chad can't communicate with anyone on death row? At least initially, he cannot communicate with anyone. I do believe that he will be allowed communication with family and will be allowed visitors. So there will be a point that he'll be allowed some communication with family and will be allowed to have visits. They may not be in-person visits. They may be video visits. But I'm pretty sure that, I mean, it would be beyond awful to deny people. He certainly will be allowed contact with clergy. So although he's been excommunicated, he will be allowed spiritual advisor and clerical kind of visits, either in person or by video. So. Is Charles and Brandon's trial being tried together or separate? They're being tried together. They're actually, they were indicted on separate case numbers, but as far as I know, they're being tried together. I just saw a question go by. Do we know whether Charles and Lori and Chad were ever properly married in the temple? No, they were not. Chad sealed them together in the temple, but no, they were not. And Lori was not married, as far as I know, Lori was not married to any of her husbands in the temple. All of her husbands were converts. Joe Ryan converted, and so did Charles. And so they, in fact, Colby Ryan's dad converted, but it was after he and Lori were separated. He was trying to win her back. But Joe Ryan converted, and then Charles Vallow converted. But everything I know is that she was never married in the temple, except for this sort of rogue sealing that Chad supposedly did. But they were never properly sealed in the temple. I don't think they could have been. I don't think they could have met the requirements. Good questions. Hey, Bo Peep, I love this. Will Chad be provided the Book of Mormon so he can figure out what he got wrong? Absolutely. He will be allowed spiritual books, the Bible, the Book of Mormon, and the other Mormon canon, which is Doctrine and Covenants, and a book called The Pearl of Great Price. So yeah, usually they come in a volume, the Book of Mormon and all of the other Mormon canon, and he'll be allowed those. Yes, inmates are allowed Bibles and certainly the Book of Mormon. So you can study up. Hi, Bo Peep. You know, I don't know. There are a couple of people out there doing a bang-up job on Kohberger. And the only reason I would cover Kohberger would be if I was going to write a book about it. And I don't see that right now. I have a couple of other other ideas for books that are sort of rattling around up here, I will tell you that Andrea Burkhart, she is an attorney who is in Eastern Washington. I think she's in Spokane, which is pretty close to Moscow. And she's doing a wonderful job. She does great analysis, and she has been attending the trials. We don't know at this point whether that trial, all of it's going to be live streamed, under what circumstances, if it's going to be restricted. We don't know any of that yet. So we need to wait and find out. And they haven't even set a trial date, and they keep pushing back dates on discovery disputes. And but Andrea's done a really great job with that case. I mean, really getting down in the weeds with the discovery disputes and all of those things. So, you know, I'm not going to say never, but right now I don't see doing a real deep dive on it. I'm certain that if it's live streamed, I'll watch it and comment. But as far as doing a deep sort of concentrating on it, I don't think so. I'm really interested to get caught up on Karen Reed. That's one that fascinates me because of the reasonable doubt. Same with Delphi, but I don't see that. I do have an idea for a book that would cover at least 3 cases that kind of have a common theme that I'm sort of noodling about. So stay tuned. Ladybug Lady, I'm in your pre-order launch team. Will you let us know where to post the wonderful reviews? Absolutely, I'll let you know. So, couple things to talk about with the Launch League. What I'm waiting for is the book is in its complete form, and they are doing the typesetting on it. Once that's done, it will be in a PDF format, so it will look like the book. And that's the point, that you all will get it. And you will get that. I think it's going to be somewhere between mid and late June. They'd hope to have it ready by the 1st of June, but of course, with Chad's trial inching along, I think we've had to slip that a little bit. But somewhere in the second half of June, I'm going to email that PDF to all of you. And then I will remind everybody where the places are to post the reviews. The places that are going to help me the most are going to be Amazon and the book site. My mind just went after 2 hours of talking to everybody. Good books. And so those are the 2 places that are important to have reviews. Amazon is important because if I get 60 reviews, good, bad, or indifferent, you got to hit the magic number of 60. I'm hoping they'll all be good. But once you hit the magic number, then the algorithm picks it up and starts recommending the book, puts it in people's recommended for you file. So that's kind of what I'm shooting for. I have Goodreads, thank you. And that's what I'm shooting for. And so I have some little bits of swag that I'm going to hand out. I have special book plates for all of you. So if you post a review, I'll be sending out personalized book plates to each of you. And while we are waiting for the book to come out, we're going to do some kind of like members only live streams where we'll get together and do some Q&As, might do a little like Zoom conference call. So, a little more intimate setting. And we're going to do some of that as well. So once we get closer to launch date, I will be posting a lot about where to post your reviews. There are some suggested like sample reviews that are on the site. on the book launch site. And so those are helpful if anybody's kind of like, well, I don't know what to say. You know, there's some that are in there that sort of give you an idea. You know, you can kind of say, oh, well, okay, I can talk about this, or, you know, they give you some ideas. So you can use those as sort of a template. And well, I'll be giving you lots more information about how that's going to work once we get a little bit closer. And I want to thank everybody who signed up. There's 116, I think, on the list. And so it's super exciting. I met a lot of folks at CrimeCon. A lot of people were really interested in the book. Several people who said they'd already pre-ordered. And so I signed book plates for anybody who pre-ordered. And so it was super fun. How long do you think Kohberger's trial will last? Whew. They've got a lot of digital stuff. Not only do they have digital information, phone and location data information, but they also have a ton of all of that genetic genealogy and all that stuff. Boy, there's a lot to go through. And there's 4 victims. So I think you're probably looking at 6 to 8 weeks and then a penalty phase. I think you're looking every bit as long as Chad's. So, and I have been incredibly impressed with Ann Taylor and her team. That's Brian Kohberger's defense attorney. She is court appointed. She is the head of the public defender in that county. She's super experienced and she is incredibly prepared. Every time I've seen her appear for a hearing, man, she is just right on things. And she's impressive. She's one of those people I'm like, well, I'd want her. So, yeah. Let's take a couple more questions and we'll wrap up. I do want to remind you that I do go through the chat and I do go through the comments that you leave. And if you're shy and don't want to post either place, you can drop me an email and I answer those too. Jane Blackbird, are you following the possible serial killer in Portland? You know, that one is one that interests me. This is a guy who was in prison. We don't really know what his background was, whether or not there are going to be more victims out there. And yeah, I am a little bit more interested in that case. And of course, it's in my backyard practically. Portland is an easy drive from Bend, about 2 hours, unless you have a lead foot like me. So yeah, it is one that I'm somewhat interested in, and we certainly will be talking about it on the channel as time goes on. Don't forget, we have a Facebook group if you want to join the Facebook group. Don't forget to post your comments down below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, please. We're so close to 10,000. I know that's not a lot. I mean, there are a lot of creators out there who have 100,000, but I'd love to hit 10,000. So thank you. I will be doing more newsletters. I know that you all like the newsletters because they really get in the weeds. They're really, that's where I really sort of, you know, quote the statutes and explain how they apply and talk about the case law and those kind of things. And so, you know, you need a ghillie suit. You need to get in the weeds with me. And I will be doing more of those. Now that the book is done and I have a little bit more breathing room, a little bit more bandwidth, you know, it was hard. I'd write all day and edit all day. And then I'd think, whew, I really need to do a newsletter. And I, you know, didn't have anything in the tank. So now I can do that. Yes, we are doing a quilt. It is a folded paper piece that looks like a folded origami crane for Kay and Larry. The pattern is in the show. The link to the pattern is down here in the show notes and on the screen. And use a black background. The square finishes to 6 inches, and I'll do the rest. Somebody asked me, which I thought was a wonderful idea, if you're not a quilter, but you can fold origami cranes, send me those, because somebody had the brilliant idea of packing the quilt in or folded origami cranes. And I thought that was a brilliant, beautiful idea. So if you are a paper folder, start folding cranes and send them to me as well. But I guarantee that once the move is over and I can get my sewing machine out of storage and all my gear out of storage, we're going to finish this quilt and get it off to Kay and Larry. So I want to say thanks to everybody. Yes, last call for wristbands. I want to say thank you so much to everybody who joined us tonight. Thanks for spending your Wednesday with me. Thanks for spending all your Wednesdays with me. I appreciate them all. Thanks to everybody who's pre-ordered the book. And I'm going to be talking a lot more about it as time goes on. And thanks for joining us tonight. A special thanks to Jen, who's always ready to step up, whether I text her and say, can we do a surprise live, or are you ready? Or, you know, tonight she came on early to help me check my sound. So I appreciate her and all she does. And with that, I'm going to say good night. I will see you next week for another True Crime Wednesday.